So I think the previous panel was really cool in talking about content creation and how you can utilize your leverage in the market to really build on your existing capabilities. The next panel is something which I'm personally really excited about. I know all of you are as well. It's actually a behind-the-scenes fireside chat where you will get to hear from Ben Smith, who was the former technical advisor to the CEO, Sundar Pichai, at Google, moderated by Shuo Chen, who is a Decode board member and also the general partner at IOVC. In this panel, you can expect to hear about lessons from the early days of Google. Ben was one of the first few employees at this huge tech giant that we see today, so definitely get your questions ready for the end of the panel. But without further ado, going to welcome Shuo and Ben to the stage.
Thanks a bunch, Sejal. Super excited to have Ben here. Please grab any seat. Super excited to have Ben here with us today because it's a real treat, given you're very private online. As we were just chatting, can't find much information about you online. So definitely start thinking about questions that you all might have for Ben and ask him for all sorts of good stories. So hi, everyone. My name is Shuo. Wonderful to see a lot of familiar faces. I run a venture fund called IOVC. We invest in pre-seed software companies, but what's also really cool is that I'm on the faculty at UC Berkeley and I get to work with a ton of the organizers as part of Decode. So really exciting to see their annual conference come together. And also thank you all for being here. I know we are pretty much the last session right before the board AMA, so thank you for sticking to the very end. Promise it'll be good. So without further ado, want to launch into Ben's story. So Ben, obviously you were one of the earliest employees at Google. Can you start even a little bit further back about your background, your story, how you even ended up at Google in the first place, and then tell us a little bit more about that story?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was a PhD student at UC Santa Barbara, and the summer of '99 I was looking for an internship. And one of my professors, let's say, or a Google employee, probably 5, had been a professor at UCSB and had just started at Google, and my advisor said you should go talk to him. And I was doing distributed systems research at the time, which was what I was really excited about. I'm like, I don't do information retrieval. That's just not my thing. He says, no, you really ought to talk to those guys. They do a lot of distributed systems. Turns out that's almost everything that Google does. I ended up there for the summer, and I stayed there for 21 years. And I think a part of what really got me to stick there was I got really excited about the product. I think search as a product is a super compelling product. I think it is a very useful product. I think it solves a lot of problems for a lot of people, and that got me really excited. From a technical engineering perspective, they're really cool problems, right? The scale at which Google operates, the distributed system scale, the user scale was just kind of blew my mind, even back in summer of '99, and it kind of only got bigger.
Before I ask you further questions, I want to ask you for more details about how your role evolved over the 20-some years as well, because we literally, in one sentence, blurred over 2 decades. So tell us a little bit more about how that role evolved and what are some of the coolest projects you got to work on.
Okay. I started as an engineer. I was hired as an engineer. I think there were about a dozen of us doing engineering. It was a very flat structure. Google stayed very flat for probably way longer than it ought to have. And I was working on search. As an engineer, because everybody was working on search. I did engineering as an engineer, probably 5 or 6 years, and then I started doing management. And over the years, my scope grew. I ran a large chunk of engineering, mostly on the product infrastructure side of the house. I did a lot of search infrastructure. I started Borg, which was the cluster management system that Google uses still today. And I did a lot of work on the identity team. I actually did a lot of work on privacy too. By the end, I was a fellow, which is a technical title. I was a VP, and then my last 2 or 3 years there, I was a tech advisor for Sundar.
I think for a lot of folks sitting in the audience, we have a good kind of portion of the audience who are students, and then of course a lot of other folks who are experienced. For maybe the students who are in the audience, can you tell us a little bit more about how you thought about your career in terms of how you even figured out to join Google in the early days?
That's a crazy question. I'm not sure I have a great answer for that. I think a lot of it for me was I think I was really lucky in that I got to work on problems I was interested in, and that for a large fraction of what drove me was this is a really interesting problem. This is an important problem, and part of being lucky at Google was there were a ton of those. I think there were paths I ended up heading down when I was at Google, and it was important work, but it was not stuff I loved doing. And I wasn't my best employee then, and I would shift to go do something different because this is not the kind of work that I want to be doing. Google's ended up being a huge place, and it had the advantage of a lot of opportunities in that context. But for me, a lot of it was I got excited about interesting and hard problems, and I felt like even in the context of being at Google for 21 years, that's a long time to be in a single place, and what it is. But the company kept changing, and the kinds of problems kept changing. The company that I started at in '99 was very, very different than the company that I left in 2020. And you have probably at least a dozen different companies in the midst of all of that. And so it felt very different kind of throughout the whole time.
Yeah, I actually want to dig into that a little bit more because we were chatting before about how now in retrospect it seems like Google's business model is so obvious, but in those early days when you were there it was not so obvious. So tell us a little bit more about how those early days looked and some of the lessons learned, and even around how the core engineering product and the business model even came together.
That's a lot. There's a lot of question there. So to set the context, it was '99. Most people had never heard of the internet. Most people thought the internet was maybe AOL. I'm not kidding. Most people got on the internet by dial-up, right? And so there was not the Wi-Fi, there was not the phones, and so even the concept of internet was not something that was really in the public consciousness at the time. And there was the craze of Netscape. I think that was '95 or '96. And it was starting to be a thing. This was, maybe you might see a domain name on a Super Bowl ad, which was kind of really shockingly spectacular. But at the time, in retrospect, Google looks inevitable. At the time, there had been 3 or 4 years of search engines, and they were kind of known to be not viable businesses. There was a Lycos, there was an Alta Vista, actually here out of Berkeley, Inktomy. Eric Brewer's startup, also a distributed systems problem that found search. And it was kind of interesting for Google to go into this space. And I remember having lots of conversations with people that how is Google going to make money? And Google's model initially was search as a service. They would sell search to all of those internet companies that were really exciting in the late 90s, early 2000s. Because you wanted to do your own site search sort of thing, and we were really good at that. Same business that Inktomy was. That market kind of collapsed when all of our customers went out of business, right? If you're selling search as a service to a company and the company's out of business, it's really hard to continue to draw revenue from them. And so that forced a big shift. And I think part of the reason it collapsed was the business model of the internet in the late 90s was banner ads. Banner ads, pop-up, pop-unders, all of that sort of stuff. And a big part of the dot-com collapse was advertisers realized that those ads were worthless. They didn't drive customers, they didn't drive sales, and so they stopped spending money, and all of these businesses that had been dependent on that revenue stream died. Which forced Google to find a completely different kind of revenue stream, Google didn't want to do banner ads, but search as a service was just not viable because there weren't any customers left for some approximation of none. And so that is kind of how Google ended up down the path of the ads business that they had in search today, which is really They did the search as a service. They did a CPM, which is cost per impression sort of business. That didn't work very well because incentives weren't well aligned. They ended up on the cost per click CPC business, which then aligns a whole lot of incentives. And there was a lot of discipline about how Google did that because if advertisers don't make ads that users like, the users don't click. If Google shows ads that the users don't like, Google's wasted real estate. And so like that ends up aligning a whole lot of incentives. And that was really the beginning of the rocket ship there. I think the last piece of it that really transformed the business was, it's hard to imagine these days, but if you wanted to buy ads back in 99, 2000, your salespeople would call their salespeople, and you would work together and get some creatives, and then they'd send the marketing collateral and blah, blah, blah. It was really the show up with a credit card, go to a forum, type in your information, and 30 minutes later your ad is on the site. And that was, I think, the kind of the final piece of the unlock around the business model. A long-winded answer, sorry.
No, I think in addition to just doing brief internet history for folks to remember those days, I think an important detail to pick up there is what we were starting to talk about earlier around how oftentimes when capital is tight or markets are difficult, it tends to be when it enables some of the best companies to be built. And Google was started a year before the dot-com bust. So it wasn't successful because of the dot-com boom, but it was successful partly because it learned how to do more with less during those harder days. And I think for a lot of the students and entrepreneurs in the audience today, they're building in an environment where it's not the same capital abundant environment that we were in just a couple years ago. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more, because it's directly relevant for them all. What were some of the benefits that Google was able to derive during those days because things were harder?
Yeah, there were I can think of at least three, so hold me to that. First, Google is really lucky from a talent perspective. All those startups that had gobbled up all the talent, they went out of business. There was a glut of brilliant people on the market, and Google was the only company hiring, right? So Google was able to cherry pick a whole bunch of really, really smart employees and retain them. So that was a huge advantage. I think there was one of the other things that Google did, partially because the capital markets dried up, but partly because of the inclination of the company, is there was a lot of, I guess, engineering discipline about how we built, not just what we built. And well, I think one of the most interesting technical and product things about search as an engineering problem is it's an engineering problem where the more compute you throw at the problem, the better the results, right? But it's also an engineering problem where there's obviously more than one way of doing things. Like what most naive version of search, for folks that don't understand search, when you go type a query into the box, Google doesn't go download the whole internet right there on the fly and do a whole bunch of work. Like there's not enough compute in the universe to solve that problem. Google's done a whole bunch of work in advance. And as you think about how you build your system, there's a whole lot of ways of doing the same problem but smarter or more efficiently. And that, if you have that kind of discipline as you're building, those don't change, they don't change the user experience. Right? When you search, you still get great results. They don't change necessarily even the quality of the results, which is part of the user experience, but it changes how much money it costs. And so if you're thinking about a business, if you spend, if it costs you, if you make a dollar per million or 100,000 or whatever, dollar per thousand searches, say, but it costs you $2, you have a crappy business. Right? But if you spend less than $1 to do 1,000 searches, and you can make that dollar be 80 cents and then 70 cents and 60 cents and 50 cents, suddenly your margins get really, really nice. And so Google, partially because of the timing of the dot-com crash, partly because of the talent, was able to spend a lot of time and energy on that long-term engineering that changed how search worked, but not necessarily what the product was. And when you change how it works, then you have more money, and then you can spend some of that money on making your index bigger, or your results faster, or spend more time looking at more results, which then gets you better quality. And so you have that leverage to start trading off because of the discipline on how you build.
I think there's a couple of takeaways here from what you've shared. One is for aspiring founders or folks who are building now, this is a great time to be thinking about talent because that's probably one of the most scarce resources here. And then to your second point, it's also a great time to be thinking about how to do engineering better for the long term. So not just building a good product now, but continuing to iterate on that. And speaking of the how, this is a conversation we've had before that I think is really interesting to share with the group here. We've talked about the difference between of how we think about search versus how we think about generative AI, given that has been all the buzz in the news. So I thought it could be interesting for you to share with everyone a little bit more because you've described the how of engineering search better. How does that ecosystem look relative to all these LLMs that are emerging?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think you're sitting here and you're saying, well, I'm not building a search engine. How is this relevant? Actually, some of you might actually be building a search engine. You actually just don't know it. That's probably half of the companies that I interact with and advise. They're like, we're doing X, Y, and Z. I'm like, you realize that's a search problem? I'm like, no. And then you walk through and you're like, here's kind of what search is and at some level, I'm of the belief that search is one of those fundamental product primitives. In the same way that identity is. When you think about your product, many products at their core are a search problem. Like you're trying to find the right thing in a bucket of stuff. But I think as you're thinking about from a generative AI perspective, you have, if you step back, there's a bunch of principles where you're thinking about changing the how of your engineering. And some of the companies I work with, they will say, hey, we do this extraction across content, and it's a very expensive problem, and we need to refresh it on a periodic basis, and it's costing us a ton of money. And if you think about something like Google search, if you're crawling a bunch of web pages, you don't crawl all the web pages at the same frequency. You pick the most important ones and you crawl them more often, or the ones that are more likely to change and crawl them more often. If you think about that from a generative AI perspective, if you're doing extraction across a large blob of data, you might choose which blobs of data you care about more. Like it might make more sense to extract information from videos that users use a lot, or you make a lot of revenue a lot, and you might even want a higher quality model to apply to that content than you would for stuff that matters less. And you don't say, I don't do the stuff that doesn't matter. It just has a lower priority. It's refreshed less often with lower fidelity. And so thinking about changing how you build, it works there too, where it's like not all content is equal, not all users are equal. Maybe your paying customers get a better quality experience, faster latency. Maybe you think about even caching results so that you don't do the same work multiple times. There's a lot of the same sort of kind of how you build principles that seem to be universal to engineering.
Speaking of search being kind of a fundamental core problem, we've talked about some specific examples. Can you share with us some examples? I think we talked about email, for example, being kind of a form of a search problem. We've talked about photos even being a type of a search problem. If you can share that a little bit more with the folks in the audience.
Sure. How many people use Gmail? Okay. You know what your inbox is. It's just a search. It's a search across the database of your email with the query term is in inbox. Right, and Google kind of betrays that as you can kind of do the custom searches. You can say is : in inbox. It's just a search. And like if you click on your sent tab, it's just another search. And you can take those search terms and add, Ben Smith, is in sent to Ben Smith. That's just a search, but even your inbox itself is just a search. And if you think about search kind of as a core problem, there's a problem of retrieval, which is finding results that matter, and there's a problem of ranking. And Gmail says retrieval is all the emails that match your query words, and the ranking is sort by time. It's just a search. And it's actually implemented underneath as a search.
One cool thing that you pointed by mine too, that I always noticed before, but I didn't know why, was when I get different search results when I just type in the keywords versus when I actually enter the keywords. I just thought that was a cool detail. Can you share that with the audience?
They actually run on two different systems. What we call suggest, what Google would call suggest, where doesn't sort by time.
Actually, can I
That's sort of
ask how many
relevance.
people notice? Has anyone else noticed that in Gmail, when you just type in the keywords and it suggests a few emails,
Before you hit enter.
before you hit enter is actually very different than when you hit enter? Has anyone else noticed that? Yeah, I noticed that so many times, and then it was only until after I talked to Ben that I figured out why.
So in search, you know, like I said, the search as a execution is typically done in two stages. You retrieve the results that are possibly relevant, and then you organize them by importance, right? And one is retrieval, one is ranking. Ranking, there are all sorts of different kinds of ranking algorithms you could apply. Like if you think about something like your Facebook feed, it's actually a search too, right? And it ranks by whatever their decision about what should be up at the top of your feed. And the suggest box on Gmail actually does relevance-based ranking, where once you hit enter, it just does time-based ranking.
Yeah, so for a lot of you who are building startups, it could be that you think it's a complex problem, but it's formed by a few kind of foundational problems that are rooted in search. So absolutely a conversation to continue here. I was looking at all the questions that we had collected, we had talked about in advance, and that I collected from just audience members throughout the day. I don't think we'll have time to get to all of the clusters of them, but I'll ask maybe one last question from my side, and then open it up to folks who want to raise their hand so you can start thinking about your questions here. Since we're running out of time here, the last question I want to throw you, Ben, is when you're thinking about now kind of your career in retrospect, what were some of the most unexpected lessons that you had picked up during this time that you think would be highly beneficial for folks here, whether they're joining a large tech company or they're founding a company of their own?
Oh my goodness, I was afraid you were going to ask that question. It's a really good question. I think one of the fundamental differences, especially when you start a company, versus coming out of academia. You come out of school, and if you learn the material in the course and you master it, you'll get an A, right? The rest of life doesn't work that way. As a startup, if you listen to what your advisors say, or you listen to what I say, or your board says, and you do it, it doesn't mean you're going to win. It doesn't mean you succeed. And at some level, what you need to do is you need to take it in as data. Right? You shouldn't ignore what people say, but ultimately the path you take, the decision you make as a founder or as an employee is your own. And you end up being responsible for the outcome. And I think especially when you're thinking about starting a company, right? If you only rely on conventional wisdom, you will only be treading a path that other people have already gone down. Your only hope is to out-execute people, which is not a great path to be on. I think conversely, if you start a company, you say, I'm going to do everything different. I'm going to build my own data centers. I'm going to build my own HR system. I'm going to reinvent the internet before I get started on my problem. You will almost also certainly fail. And so as you're thinking about it, you need to be very intentional about the set of established principles that you break, where you think you have a key advantage, and then go along with the rest of it, because you can't boil the ocean.
It's really helpful advice to end on before we open up to questions. Oh yeah, I'd love to open up to questions. Mike.
Yeah. So I want to go back to search. And all of big tech has all had this incredible ambition to build a real business around healthcare. And they've all failed. And now with electronic medical records being much more ubiquitous in massive amounts of clinical data and medical records, there's another opportunity to invent search to really help around so many use cases in the medical community. Google just announced this Vertex AI, if I'm not mistaken, right? And the message was they're going to use all of that great search knowledge to be able to bring together all of the medical information to allow for a lot better diagnosis. So I'd love to get your perspective on whether that's a realistic vision at this point. This is going to be the difference maker for them.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I am no longer at Google, and I don't speak for Google. I think it has a lot. I don't know the specifics of this product that you're talking about. I think it has a ton of potential. I think one of the reasons I think search is in many ways a core primitive when you're talking about product is anytime you have more data than you know what to do with, and you want to find the right bit, search is really good. I think even this is where AI is incredibly useful because it is tremendous at finding hidden patterns in massive data sets. And so I think the combination of those two done very well, I think my intuition, I'm also not a doctor, my intuition is that that if you have a good, clean data set around a lot of health outcomes, a lot of treatment, a lot of patient diagnostics, there's a whole lot of really interesting, useful things, patterns that you can find in that space that human beings just don't see.
Part of our job as board members is to ask tough questions, so that's great. Any other questions? Don't be scared. We don't bite. Yes.
Hi. I've seen in the past a couple text-based, search-based applications come out, like Akiflow. I don't know if you are familiar with it. I was wondering, this is a very useful way to go about finding and retrieving information, documents, anything really. And I was wondering what, according to you, is the reason it hasn't taken on in as far as UI goes for like the mass adoption.
I'm not familiar with the product. Could you explain?
It's like a text. It's like a search query. Are you familiar with Spotlight on Mac?
Yeah.
Essentially, it's Spotlight on steroids, and you can do everything with it. And it's very powerful. And I was wondering why, because even for example, when I'm looking for something on my iPhone, like a contact, I want to call someone. Instead of going into my phone in my contact list, I'll just pull down and then search for that contact. And yeah, I was wondering.
So it's effectively multi-corpus search.
Sorry?
It's multi-corpus search. You're searching a lot of different data sets at once.
Exactly,
Yeah.
with just a search bar.
Yeah. No, it is a brilliant idea and it's a super useful concept. It gets hard for like 3 or 4 or 5 different reasons. One is you need to make sure you have access to all the data, and that in and of itself can be very, very hard to do. If you look at the different kind of corpuses, whether it's your contacts, whether it's your email, whether it's your calendar, even from a retrieval perspective, it gets really, really hard because your calendar is really sparse from a word perspective. And if you and I are having a meeting, and we had it on our calendar here for decode, and we said, Berkeley, word Berkeley is not in the calendar tree. It's not going to retrieve that meeting, right? And so there's a retrieval problem around various different kinds of corpuses, and Google has that problem when you talk about images versus news versus shopping versus search already today. But on top of the retrieval problem, because you have to kind of do custom retrieval for each kind of corpus, you have a ranking problem because it's really hard to know which result to show first, because there's such different kinds. That maybe the contact should go first, or the calendar, or the email, or the document, but they end up being it's like trying to compare a hamburger and a car, right? Which is better? Well, depends on what you want to do, right? And so they're non-comparable types, and it's a little hard to figure out what to show first. It's an incredibly important problem, and it's incredibly useful when it works. I think the reason it's not easily been solved at scale is what you end up seeing for most of them is, here's one kind of results, here's another kind of results, here's another kind of results, here's another kind of, there's no real attempt to blend them together.
All right, last question. I know we have the round table afterwards as well for anyone who's signed up, but we'll take one last question.
Very quick question. Can OpenAI put Google out of business?
Can OpenAI, that's a great question. Maybe. I think any, my opinion again, any business, if you look back 20, 25 years, there were a number of businesses that seemed on top of the world, and they're not here today. I think almost any business is at risk. And so I think it's kind of hard to tell, what business will be here in 20 years or 10 years or 15 years. I don't know. I think there are kind of fundamentals around economics that make it hard for an OpenAI, for example, to replace what Google search does. I think that's hard in the short term because if you look at the cost per query, if you're doing a search versus the cost per a generative AI answer, they're not exactly comparable. And so you need to be able, we were talking earlier, you need to be able to make enough money off of something that OpenAI does to cover your costs if you want to have a viable business. So I think there's a ton of risk kind of on all ends of the spectrum. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. If you do, I would love to look at it.
If I could actually add one more thing, Ben, I actually learned this from you because cost per query in terms of just the unit economics of how much this query costs is one thing, but you had also shared this other thing with me, which is whether or not you're contributing to a positive ecosystem. So in Google search, if I'm New York Times and I'm offering you my content, I get traffic back in return, so I get that positive feedback loop. Whereas if I'm OpenAI, well, I use all this data, I train, but I don't send anything back to where I got original training data from. And I thought you made a really good point on, that's another key point to think about, whether or not you're building a larger ecosystem overall, because one, you're incentivizing partners to join in on a broader ecosystem, and the other, kind of doing this alone.
You end up demonetizing the traffic that you need for your business, right? Because you don't send the traffic back, they can't serve ads against it, they can't have users. And so, this is part of why the newspapers are suing all of the big companies, as I understand it, is you take our content and you steal our traffic, and we have no business left. And if they lose, then they stop creating the content that you need to run your models. And if they win, the cost of your models go up. It's a tricky economics problem, and I do not have a crystal ball to know how it shakes out.
I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with all of you. We talked a lot from search as a primal problem all the way to kind of career advice. We can definitely continue the conversation in the roundtable, but we'll also be here after the roundtable at the end of the conference if anyone wants to stick around and ask questions. So thank you so much, Ben, for such an insightful panel, and thank you all for your questions.